Welcome back to the Nautical Chronicle. I'm here, Clossington, and I'm here with my special guest from Canada, Fortissax. As of now, you are the very first non-American that I've invited onto the show.
Wow.
Um, I mean, I've, this is, I think, episode 5 or 6. Yeah, I think it's episode 5, but first non-American. Um, is there so First off, I want to apologize to the audience for being about 15 minutes late. We've both my guest and I have had all sorts of trains, planes, and automobiles um, shenanigans going on in the background. Me in particular, like I've let's see, yeah. Unfortunately, my desktop tower has been kind of bricked, and I probably won't be getting it back for another week. So the Alabama that I'm supposed to usually be working on during these streams, rest assured, I am tinkering with it. Just my camera just isn't up to snuff right now. But the show must go on. Force, how are you doing at this late hour?
Yes, sir. I'm doing quite all right, and I wanted to thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be here as the first Canuck on your show. Yeah, long day of work, but you know what? I've been looking forward to this. The Quiet Revolution is one of my favorite topics and one that I'm most knowledgeable about. So,
Yeah, I in terms of foreign guests, uh, over the weekend, well, I'm going to be conducting about this is 1 out of 5 of the second round of live streams. Tomorrow, I'm going to be hosting Capitalissimo to talk about fraternalism in the United States, like the state of fraternalism in the United States. Uh, upcoming Saturday, I'm going to be streaming with Morgoth's Review to discuss the absolute state of North FC, um, and we have a few nautically themed topics to go over. Sunday, another Brit, Iron Duke. We're going to be discussing uh, foreign relations between the United Kingdom and the Confederacy and the Union during the Civil War. And then next Thursday, Dave Martell and I are going to be talking Pennsylvania esoterica. But this topic is something that almost no one in America actually knows about. It's I came across it while discussing with this one Canadian in a Discord voice chat like 4 or 5 years ago. He brought it up like something like you know up until the 1960s, Quebec was this sort of rural feudal theocratic French ethno state that was almost frozen in time up until the 60s. And I forget the exact terminology that he used, but he said something along the lines of, as soon as like rock and roll and Elvis was introduced, the glass like facade just shattered, and this new Quebec arose, for good or for ill. I've heard somewhat mixed opinions from Canadians on this,
mhm.
whether it was dragged out of the dark ages and into this new industrial revivalist
Yeah, I
era.
mean, what they tell us in history class, especially if you're from Quebec, like if you're from the province, is that there was an age called La Grande Noirceur, or the Great Darkness, and this is the era of Maurice Duplessis and his political party, the Union Nationale. Um, the Union Nationale was all about radical traditionalist Catholicism. It was about agrarian rural living. Um, they did not like the cities. They did not like public investments. They did not like modernity. To be frank, they were not interested in technological innovation within the province.
Well, the the the
But
Duplessis administration is I thought it was a sort of mixture of two different, I guess, political formulas, and it's something that I don't really see too often. Um, and that is an administration that is both uh, very socially conservative, but incredibly, uh, I guess, kind of two-faced in the way that it approached the economy. Duplessis was the premier of Quebec between, was it 40, sometime in the mid 30s to 60, correct?
that's right, when he died.
Yeah, and his economic policy was something like the regular Quebecois were encouraged to return to these manorial, sort of feudal farmland plots, while the reigning the Union Nationale uh, encouraged economic liberalism, where all of the extractive uh, portions of the Quebec economy were doled out to English speaking Canadians and Americans. So like
Something to that, yes.
peasantry for we, uh, like mine and like mines and factory boss for thee. And it
Yeah,
yeah.
they were very anti-union. They were very socially conservative. They were liberal to a point. I wouldn't go as far as to say like full-scale Anglo-liberal capitalism, but they were certainly more liberal than what would come after it. That being said, free market capitalism is has a contentious relationship with English Canada. It always has. We've never really adopted free market capitalism quite the same way that the United States has. But the Union Nationale and that government reigned for a very long time, and not under him, but who they were really inspired by came before. And the seeds of the Quiet Revolution really start in or around the 1920s and towards the late 1910s, namely in something called Regulation 17, which was a law passed. It was a provincial law in Ontario that prohibited the building of any new French and Catholic schools. Um, and I covered this on the stream last night with Wogpog and Black Horse and Dimes, and we were discussing this. But much of the Anglo-Franco tensions occurred because this was viewed as a slap in the face, whereas an otherwise amicable previous few centuries had occurred. All of a sudden, the biggest province of Anglo-Canadians decided to turn against them and prohibit them from building new schools. This was one of the major catalysts for the conscription crisis of 1917. And although there's some nuance there, and although Quebec gets put into the spotlight, namely that the riots in Quebec were intense, um, and they were angry because they viewed this as a betrayal by English Canada. But 30,000 French Canadians volunteered in the First World War, and I believe 50,000 volunteered in the Second World War, or it's the other way around. But either way, a not insignificant number of people did. And this event, combined with an ideology that was circulating around the province called clerical nationalism, was starting to pick up steam. In particular, one figure by the name of Lionel Groux, who was a priest, who was a Catholic priest. He was a very prominent priest, very well educated priest, and he was also a historian. And under a pen name, this Catholic priest wrote and mythologized French Canadian heroes like Dollard des Ormeaux, in particular, who is known for throwing a powder keg at Iroquois and while being ambushed and saving the lives of him and his men um, while exploring. So he was an ultra nationalist. He was a French Canadian radical traditionalist Catholic ethnic nationalist and also ultramontist. He believed that the Pope's word was law, period. He did not really respect secular authorities. Um, these were big Pope enjoyers, these were big Pope
Well,
enthusiasts.
there's
And
there's a little bit of a I'd like to make a few different points about clericalism in, I guess, Quebec. Uh, the sort of close relationship between the Catholic Church and politics, where the Catholic Church was very strongly in league with the Union Nationale and the various, I guess, the various political machinations of of proto Canada, where the church was lockstep with the government,
That's right.
and
And you might
the,
even say that the Union Nationale was the manifestation of this ideology in practice, somewhat.
yeah, so like this noob comes in and says like I don't know what the hell's going on here. Um, in I remember hearing from quite a few guys from the UK who have said that the Church of England's vast push to uphold the party line and encourage enlistment during the world wars lost them an absolute ton uh, of good faith with the public, because people just signed up for the slaughterhouse, like at the behest of the church, which was such an obvious lackey of the government. Um, and then you have to mix it with just the fact that in Quebec, all of the, like, was it both the school system and the
Healthcare.
healthcare systems were both run by the Catholic Church. The
Right.
Catholic Church runs your healthcare, your schools, they run
And
your government.
they also owned a very not insignificant size of seigneuries. They had a lot of land, a lot of private land that was for their exclusive use.
Right. And I think the statistic was that by the 50s or 60s, about half of the Quebec population was impoverished or like in poverty or something like that. So purposeful, you know, uh, almost these very tight um, tradcath, agrarianism. This model did not particularly work for a lot of people,
No,
and I think it was very interesting that the Catholic Church almost sold out the extraction economy, while tradcath nations uh like um like Ireland managed to hold on for much longer, up until I think the 90s, and retained a lot more economic nationalism than what Quebec had. Um, but those were the few points I had. Um,
yeah. So I'll add some context to that. So firstly, as I said, there's a line between Lionel Groux, the French Canadian Catholic priest and ultra nationalist, the founder of clerical nationalism as an ideology, and the Union Nationale government. As a matter of fact, he was such a successful author and journalist that his beliefs, as well as the beliefs of Henri Bourassa, who is another Canadian nationalist figure, although he advocated for autonomy within Canada, not for separation. These ideas were circulating. The ideology of clerical nationalism was circulating. It was the idea of sovereignty and independence for French Canadian people on an ethnic basis, fused with religion. Lionel Groux was heavily inspired by Action Française in France, or sorry, and National Action, which were publications and proto-fascist Catholic organizations in the country in the interwar period and the early 1900s. And the Union Nationale government under Duplessis incorporated a lot of those ideas. They didn't fully implement them, but of the ideas that you have already covered, there was this heavy emphasis on rejecting the cities. It was rejecting the beating heart of civilization, find God, return to the earth, grow potatoes, be fruitful and multiply. And unfortunately, this was not a winning strategy. By the 1950s, the French Canadian literacy rate had plummeted, and it was incredibly low in comparison to Anglo Canadians and Anglo Americans, for that matter. And the failures of the Duplessis government and the Union Nationale were capitalized on by leftists. There were four factions of the Quiet Revolution. There were leftist secular nationalists. There were modernizing conservatives, like center-right men. There were federalist technocrats, and there were other forms of sovereigntists, and there were youth movements like Jeune Canada. Jeune Canada, having lived and worked in a predominantly English-speaking economy, had developed the professional skill sets and expertise to begin building their own managerial state, essentially, because the Quiet Revolution coincides with the rise of James Burnham's managerial revolution. It emerges at the same time as the massification of society. It emerges at the same time as all of these complex structures and systems necessary for sustaining modern life and ongoing growth emerged at this time. So too did the French Canadian managerial state, and except this was a nationalist one, at least nominally, for a great many people.
Well, the party that carried out the Quiet Revolution, which we'll get to the actual revolution, but as a sort of preamble, there were like a lot of people, a lot of these sort of documentaries that cover and lectures that cover the subject. They talk about the asbestos protest of '49, where this American was it asbestos like mine or whatever it was. It was American owned. The workers wanted to, they wanted to make $1 a day or something like that, up from like 85 cents per day, and they wanted safer working conditions because it's an asbestos plant, and um, you know they weren't particularly treated well, and this government wasn't particularly affable to any sort of pushes from unions, and it was in the middle of like the early Cold War. So what ends up happening is, you know, like you said, all of these forces are not particularly happy. The trade unionists, the aren't happy because you know they're the working man isn't doing particularly well and is impoverished. The managerial elites around Montreal aren't very happy. Those sort of literati are not very happy, and they want secularism. The nationalists don't want, you know, the Anglos, whether from Anglo Canada or Yankees from America, to rule over their entire economy. And what was the fourth faction that you brought up? Um, um,
Federalist technocrats. So,
Federalist technocrats.
so
And
people who would become what's his name? Like Jacques Parizeau. Jacques Parizeau would go on to lead the referendum attempt in 1995, but when he was very young, he was involved with federal technocrats who had colloquial ties to that province,
one of
and
one
they
of
also wanted to see change.
one of the things that strikes me as very unique about Quebec is that even to this day, um, the sort of liberal technic, like the liberal technocrats who are like the current party system in Quebec is very reminiscent of these like four different little factions where you have the CAQ, which is just the sort of general like Quebec nationalist sort of like center right separatist sort of group, and then the Quebec liberals are this Montreal liberal technocrat, run by a uh isn't she like she some sort of like uh Haitian immigrant who runs like the Quebecois like liberals or something like that. And then
So,
yeah.
are you talking? Okay, so I think it would be incorrect to say that they're technocrats today. It would be more accurate to say
Mhm.
that they were then. I would say now that they're just managerials. They're just bureaucrats. They're just people who work in the public sector. The Quebec Liberal Party, on provincially speaking, is led by um, Pablo Ramirez Gonzalez Hernandez. I don't remember his name. Anyway, he's a foreigner, and he only arrived in Canadian politics 12 years ago. He's actually an immigrant from Argentina, and his family was communist.
Oh,
So
wonderful.
yeah, yeah, just what Quebec needs. But no, your breakdown is largely correct. The CAQ is very much a center right, kind of nationalist light party, kind of diet nationalist. They're more like patriots. Um, you have the Parti Québécois, who are or were recently, until recently, the separatists. They wanted full blown separatism. They were very hard on immigration historically, very hard on assimilation, very petty with language laws, which have mixed results. They work sometimes, they don't work other times, sometimes they don't make any sense. But the caveat with them was always that they were environmentalist and feminist and all of these things. So you had these typical uh, leftist positions seen across the Western world, such as the environmentalism, the feminism, and all of this, combined with extreme anti-immigration and extreme anti-immigration sentiment, and at the very least, a cultural chauvinism that is strong enough to have stopped many of the migration that has occurred in Canada from hitting their province. And the Parti Québécois also passed, if I recall correctly, the 1992 Quebec-Canada Accord, which gives Quebec unique powers within Confederation to control the flow of immigration and to choose which countries that they come from. And so most of the immigrants who go to Quebec are from former French colonies, which leads to a different multi-ethnic makeup than, say, in Toronto. In Toronto, you get Commonwealth immigrants, you get Jamaicans and Indians and Hong Kongers and Chinese and Iraqis, Afghanis. But in Montreal, you get Lebanese, Algerians, Tunisians, Haitians, all of these things. But to circle back to your point, which was that you can sort of see the factions of the Quiet Revolution emerging out of these parties. You're certainly right to a point. The CAQ is very much like the modernizing conservatives. The left secular nationalists are more like Quebec Solidaire, which is a social democrat party in the province.
They seem absolutely insufferable
They
from
are. They
all the things I've seen about them.
it's basically okay. It is basically gay race communism from the Anglosphere transplanted into the Francophone world.
It looks like the
Um,
worst, like longhoused party,
yeah.
like that you could possibly design. Um,
Um,
but I guess what we're trying to do is paint a sort of picture of what existed prior to 1960 in Quebec, and what was the coalition that wanted to change Quebec for the better, or change it radically in a different direction, as opposed to this sort of agrarian tradcath, um, very very morally, socially conservative, into something different. Um, I've
so,
seen. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
I would just say that. So to circle back to the roots, because the official quote start date of the Quiet Revolution is 1960 with the death of Maurice Duplessis. Um, but the intellectual seeds begin between the 1900s to the 1930s. And in the year 1930, a group called Jeune Canada formed. And Jeune Canada, as I said, would become the professional and managerial class of the province. 1949 was the asbestos strike that you mentioned. 6 years later, something happened, which even my grandfather recalled, which was the Richard riots. Rocket Richard was a French Canadian hockey player, and he was penalized in a way that was viewed as discrimination against French Canadians. And what this ended up doing was causing mass riots across Montreal, across the entire province. And it was another public example of French Canadian resentment towards Ontario, towards the federal government being inconsiderate, towards the Union Nationale silence on giving some degree or better degrees of autonomy to French Canadians. And 5 years later, Jean Lesage gets elected. Jean Lesage was the mayor of Montreal, and he was also a former fascist. Fun fact.
Huh.
He was a fascist in his youth. Yeah, he was a full blown, and so was Pierre Trudeau. Actually, both Pierre Trudeau and Jean Lesage knew each other, and they were both fascists in the 1940s. And so it
Well, then,
really ramps up to 1960 with Lesage getting elected. And then in that 10-year period, or sorry, 15-year period between 60 and 76, you see this massive sweep, total sweep of reforms that are not just externally influenced, as you said, with the emergence of rock and roll, with Elvis, with hippie culture, with all of these things. A lot of it was also internal. A lot of it was internally driven. There was a lot of resentment towards the Catholic Church, towards the theocracy that had existed, because the fruits of their labor and mismanagement were visible for everybody to see. The entire continent knew that literacy rates were low, that GDP per capita was low, that people weren't happy. The job opportunities weren't there, as you said. The many of the companies were either Anglo-Canadian owned or managed, or they were American owned and Anglo-Canadian managed, without them having a large say in that. And the big changes, like the key changes or core achievements
well,
of the
well,
Quiet Revolution.
but before we get
Sure,
into
yeah.
the actual before we get into the actual revolution itself, uh, in terms of shilling, follow Fortissax on Substack with the link below. Um, but I was like earlier today, just in preparation, I came across this one video from it's like Wilhelm Apologist. He's like a Canadian right winger on YouTube. He presented the ascension of Lesage as almost this sort of he made it sound a lot more, I guess, conspiratorial than most accounts give it, where Lesage was sort of like he was bolstered by various large corporate interests from the Quebecois themselves
Hmm.
and within Liberal Party politics to be ascended to this particular role for this particular time to oversee the dismemberment of the Union Nationale. I'm a lot of the figures kind of went over my head because this isn't my history. This is Canadian
No,
history.
no.
Um,
Um,
but
there's
it
an
seems like
element.
a lot of people saw the writing on the wall,
Well,
and
there's a lot of
yeah,
there's an element of obviously elite power players making decisions at the highest levels, but the other thing too is that it was a mostly organic cultural transformation. It wasn't. It didn't need to be forced entirely top down. A lot of it was coming from the bottom up. Although Black Horse, for example, would disagree with me on that. But the truth is that it was both of these things. There, in some veins, the state enforced the Quiet Revolution top down, and in other ways, it came from the bottom up. Um, what is a trend in this era is a lot of former fascists turning to communism or turning to Marxist-Leninism, not because they necessarily agree with the tenets of uh, communism or Marxist-Leninism, but because they saw the writing was on the wall that the leftists were co-opting nationalism, that the leftists were succeeding in and leading what would be this cultural revolution. Um, and there was a degree of sincerity there for a time. That degree of sincerity is gone now. It's just pure gay race communism. But back then, there was an organic vein, and a lot of those people did not see or know that they were being taken advantage of by broader cultural forces. But again, a lot of it was internal, and Jean Lesage is an example of that. René Lévesque, a rare example of someone who wasn't. There's Georges-Émile Lapalme, there's André Laurendeau, Jacques Parizeau, as I mentioned in 1995, Claude Ryan. He was the big managerial guy, influential editor of Le Devoir, which is a newspaper. So all of these people coalesced, and then that doesn't even get into Pierre Vallière and or Vallière and Michel Lalonde. So for your listeners here, these were two either a communist or they were left progressive, democratic socialist cultural figures. And so you mentioned the influence of Elvis and rock and roll, but locally there were people like Pierre Vallière and Michel Lalonde. And Michel Lalonde wrote a poem, and the poem spoke about the grievances of French Canadians, and it was a massive hit across the continent. She was educated in an English university, and I'm trying to remember the name of it here, and I'll bring it up for you. Speak
What?
White, Par Blanc. That's what it was called. It was called Speak White.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
There, I remember coming across a a interview with was it Rene Levesque and a and he went on a sort of spiel about economic nationalism, economic populism, whatever it was, nationalizing key industries in order to get, I guess, white collar Quebecois jobs as opposed to these Anglo and Yankee jobs. And a a person in this Q&A asked if, if Quebec is going to start deporting or sending home all these non-Quebecois the same way a lot of these decolonization projects across, across Africa and the third world were. And he didn't mince words. He said, a lot of these people are quite awful and exploitative, and yeah, we probably won't mind if they went back, but this is going to be an entirely peaceful process. And the fact that this revolution was bloodless decolonization, so to speak, rather than some sort of know, hot-blooded third world conflict is part of the reason why it's called the Quiet Revolution, where we are white people. We do not conduct mass civil wars and or whatever over regime change. I mean, I say that building a civil war like ship model right now, but it's it's the revolution was entirely peaceful and conducted through these various levers of government. I guess starting with, well, one of the biggest being the Quebecois like hydraulic electrification
Yes,
projects.
Hydro Quebec is Quebec's primary electricity company. They nationalized that. That was one of the first things they did. It was one of their it's still one of their largest industries today.
Like
They
I remember coming
nationalized.
across like how widespread Anglo-American telecoms and electrical sort of cartels were, where they would absolutely just scab uh, the sort of locals, as opposed to this one big monolithic Quebecois, like big beautiful that dam system that you guys have now.
Yes. Well, that's right. And in conjunction with the nationalization of key industries such as Hydro Quebec, which Quebec is one of their crown jewels to this very day, there was also the introduction of an investment fund and the Quebec pension plan, as opposed to residents of Quebec paying into and receiving the Canada pension plan. So effectively, and also their own tax authority. So they effectively built all of these over time, over a 16-year period from 1960. And what you also saw was the expansion of the state. And this is why I say that the Quebecois nationalists built a counter managerial state to the federal government. They basically built a counter managerial ethno state at the time, juxtaposed to the federal government of Canada, um, by discarding the Catholic Church and its influence and ending the theocracy that lasted until there. And but the context I want to add to is that it wasn't entirely led by communists there. And you mentioned there's a few things you mentioned here, such as anti-colonial and third worldist. Certain elements of the Quiet Revolution certainly were. You get that with Pierre Valliere. Pierre Valliere was an open Marxist-Leninist. He was, if I'm not mistaken, an FLQ member, which was a terrorist organization.
Yeah, we'll probably get to them a little bit later.
Yeah. your closest equivalent to that faction of Quebec nationalism to this day is probably Quebec Solidaire, like you said, the ones who were in a mess, just spreading the Anglo cancer, almost identifying more with the struggle of Palestinians and Algerians, and it used to be the Irish, it used to be Sinn Féin. Now it's really just these uh, third world grievance politics groups and whatever. But at the time, that group was not dominant. They were not the majority, although they had outsized influence, but they were not the majority of people. The majority of people just wanted sovereignty. They wanted sovereignty. They wanted bread and meat. They wanted to be able to read. They wanted job opportunities. They wanted more control. And one of Levesque's phrases, if I'm not mistaken, was "maître chez nous," master of your own house, or controller of your own house. And this was what was appealing to all of those people. But go on.
Like, not to go off on too much of a tangent, but I think it was like a couple months ago when I was touring the Erie, Pennsylvania Maritime Museum. I came across this one exhibit on. I'll just share it up here. The Fenian raids. Right after the American Civil War, um, the proto IRA decided, these American Civil War vets from Ireland decided, hey, now's a great
Oh
time
yes.
to invade Canada. Um,
Their
in
plan was actually crazy because not only did they
Wait,
have custom rifles purposefully built for these raids, their plan was to occupy Canada by land and then exchange it politically through diplomacy with the British Empire for the secure release of Ireland.
y- yeah, it's a bold hostage plan, but this is almost too crazy to have actually worked. But I don't
And
know.
so, a note on the Irish too, and I think you'll find this interesting as an
Sure.
American. The Irish were wholesomely amalgamated into Anglo-Canadian identity here. There were not so much tensions between the English and the Irish in Canada as there were between the English and the Irish in, say, New England, um, especially around the 1800s and the 1900s.
Well,
The Irish were granted a sort of sense of upwards mobility, and aside from the fact that a great many of the Irish to Canada were from Northern Ireland, so a lot of them were Protestants as were, but even the Catholics such as Thomas D'Arcy McGee, who is one of our fathers of Confederation.
mhm.
Thomas D'Arcy McGee was a radical Republican. Um, he hated the monarchy, he hated the British Crown, he hated all these things. But when he came to Canada, he saw the error of his ways. He became a deeply devoted loyalist to Canada and to the British Empire. And that was the attitude of many Irish who had come to Canada. And so the struggles you see between the English and Irish in the States is something that never really occurred here.
Like, one thing that not many people, like even sort of based Americans, really realize is that a lot of those like no Irish apply, like, not hiring Irish job like posters. A lot of them are from Italian neighborhoods, and a lot of that was sort of inter immigrant, struggles over like who could take over whatever tenement house. Um, a lot of the very early like know nothings, like gang war, nativist gang war stuff is a lot of that was pretty much over by, well, a lot of that was over by like the 1870s ish, when like whole new strange hordes started coming to America's shores. But that's a little bit of a diversion.
There was also a much more prominent and powerful group of nativists that replaced them, who would reach a number of 5 million, and then succeed in encouraging Calvin Coolidge to sign the 1924 Immigration Act. But we can discuss that
Yeah,
another time.
that's like when just about everyone, even the industrial bosses, realize that we've imported too many scabs. We need to put a dam up. That's like a whole other beast. Um, but in terms of what was accomplished during the first two like liberal party administrations during the Quiet Revolution, so there was the nationalization of the of the electrical infrastructure. Um, in terms of other public services, what was done for education and healthcare? Is, was that nationalized as well, or diverted away from the Catholic Church?
Yes, exactly. So education and healthcare were fully secularized. They were put back into the hands of the government. What very few people, even Quebecers, know is that there were attempts to do this in the 1840s and the 1860s, but the Catholic Church was so powerful within the province that they reversed them. They actually shut down the public schools that were owned by the government so that they could reassert control over education. And Quebec's healthcare system came out of the Quiet Revolution in this regard, firmly under the control of the provincial government.
Jeez.
And also, what you saw was the rise of CEGEP colleges and new universities. So, on the topic of education, if you don't know what a CEGEP is, a CEGEP is like it's like grade 12 plus 2 year college, because in Quebec, like I didn't go to middle school. I went to high school in Montreal. High school for me started in grade 7. It ends in grade 11, and then you go to CEGEP. And
Hmm.
in CEGEP, you get grade 12 and then like 2 to 3-ish years of college, pre-college, or sorry, pre-university. There is no such thing as like college. In the States, you guys use college and university interchangeably, but here they're separate institutions.
Hmm.
If yeah, so Quebec has a model that is very integratable with France. There's a lot of cross international student exchanges that happen every year, every day, and it's very different from
So
Anglo North America.
I almost have to ask, what do the Quebecois think about the French language and vice versa? Because I have no clue what the general impression of how you guys figure each other's accents out. Like, it's
Oh, you mean between
y-
us and the Europeans?
yeah.
So, have you ever seen a video years ago floating around of the men on Tangier Island off the coast of Virginia?
And Tanger Island. Um,
Do you know
it,
anything about that accent?
I think I do. It's like a very old, like British accent that
Yes,
somehow survived. Yeah.
it is a very strange uh, Devon Wessex sounding transition accent from like 3 to 400 three. Oh, I guess in the States' case, it's 300 years ago. And when you hear it, you can hear the beginnings of the Southern drawl. You can hear the beginnings of their drawl. You can hear the sounds in there, but otherwise, it sounds like something from the United Kingdom.
Hmm.
Quebec French is a 400-year-old form of French. It is the French that was spoken by
Sort of just
Norman.
fossilized.
Exactly. It was predominantly spoken by Norman colonists, and secondary to that, Bretons and people from Poitevins, and who were educated in courtly French as well. That's the other thing. The French that was spoken in Quebec was the king's French, and that's partly because the filles du roi were educated by the king at the king's expense, at the state's expense. The filles du roi, as you know, or maybe you don't know, to any of your listeners, were 800 women who were rounded up from France and sent to the colonies and told to marry men and have many children. And it was a success. They were all married and pregnant within the first year. It was a
Like
miracle. It caused a baby boom.
like
Um,
but the general impression I got from the very early settlement of Quebec was that many people went there very temporarily,
mhm,
just spent a few years trapping furs and to make a profit, make a little nest egg, and then go back to France and start whatever business that you wanted. The encouragement of women or shipping 500 ladies over was to encourage permanent settlement.
that's right. That's right.
Um,
And that is because the mercantilist structure of French North America did not incentivize easily settlement or settlement that was profitable enough to be an incentive for people to migrate there, but also because it was a cold and barren wasteland filled with indigenous who were very violent and hostile, and that's the other factor to it.
yeah, I covered the Beaver Wars with Jay Burden not too long ago, where the Iroquois essentially wiped out virtually all of the other Native American tribes
Yeah,
in the
I have
Mid-Atlantic.
a whole article
Yeah,
on that. That's yeah, it's called Nationally Reconciling the Truth, and it is literally about Iroquois extermination between
yeah,
1600 to
just
1700.
exterminated almost all of the other tribes in in Lower Canada,
Yep.
just brutally, and you know now they kind of just cry about it nowadays. But I really don't. It's really kind of hard to feel bad for them, all things considered.
No,
Um,
yeah. In the Iroquois case specifically, no, I do not. I do not have any sympathy for them whatsoever.
and
But to circle back to your
yeah,
question in regards of the accent and language, yeah, it's Quebec French is a 400-year-old form of fossilized Norman and Court French, because the early colonists and the largest group of colonists in Quebec were Normans and other northwestern Frenchmen, and also because the filles du roi were educated, they were put into schools, state-funded schools, and they were shipped overseas with the purpose of populating the colony. So basically, we had state mandated GFs by the 1640s, and it was based, and everybody was happy, and they all received money by Intendant or Governor Jean Talon. Jean Talon, contrary to a lot of trad cats, contrary to a lot of guys who say just be poor and have many children, Jean Talon paid them. He gave them baby bonuses. They gave them free land to clear. They gave them salaries in some cases. They taxed bachelors. They taxed young men, and they gave them state mandated GFs. And guess what? It caused the baby boom. It succeeded. But yeah,
well,
that
to
is
to circle back to the Quiet Revolution, a lot
yeah,
of tradcads will say that after the '60s, when as soon as we get electricity, all of the Quebec birth rates just plummet, and that's one of the consequences of, I guess, introducing pop culture and I guess, for lack of the better word,
yeah. I
modernity.
mean, I think that was a civilization wide issue. There was nothing really unique in the circumstances of Quebec that did that. One thing that I will say is that second wave French Canadian feminists are ferocious. They're vicious. They're very free spirited, very independent, both in endearing ways and also in ways that make you very bitter. Um, there's an element to the patriotic character that has evolved out of that emergence of second wave feminism around the time of the Quiet Revolution and shortly thereafter. So, for example, the province of Quebec, when you marry somebody, the woman does not take your last name. And this is a convention. This is sort of
Well,
a
well, who
cultural
who are your
shift,
kids
cultural change.
supposed to? Whose name are your kids supposed to adopt?
I think you choose upon birth
Hmm.
or something to that effect.
Huh.
Yeah,
That's
but
that's
the
odd.
it's weird, right? And we don't. There are certain things and phrases that were encouraged not to be said. For example, Mademoiselle. Mademoiselle is considered um, not derogatory, but kind of demeaning. And Mademoiselle just means young lady. Um, but now you're supposed to indiscriminately refer to all women as Madame, just Madame.
Hmm.
So you have these. The Quiet Revolution is very much a mix of all of these different things, but what they all had in common effectively was sovereignty. What they all had in common, and I don't just mean political sovereignty, I mean sovereignty as people. What they all had in common was a desire for political power and collective action.
Well, one of the sort of changes made across Canada was a sort of push for bilingualism and I guess French linguistic chauvinism. That
Formal
is,
bilingualism.
yeah, formal bilingualism, and I guess pushing the French language within education specifically and across government services more broadly across Canada. Um, I'm not as a non-Canadian. I don't really have very many opinions or thoughts about it. I is was this a sort of reaction against, I guess, more anglophone infringements upon historic, you know, French domain, or was this a sort of overreaction and overcompensation, I
Well,
guess?
in my view, it's three things. Part of it was a desire to assert themselves, as you say, in the federal environment and also on the national scale. The other part of it is that a not insignificant number of Canadians have been bilingual for a very long time. Since the British conquest in 1763, literally the first thing that the Anglo elites did was intermarry with French Canadians. And this is true of Simon McTavish, Joseph Frobisher, the founders of the Northwest Company, which was the competitor of the Hudson Bay Company, um, uh, John Redpath, James McGill, who founded McGill University, John Molson, who founded John Molson Business School. All of these Anglo-Scottish elites intermarried with French Canadians, and so there was already an elite culture that was bilingual and that was dual ethnic, that
So,
was of both British and French heritage. So, in my view, this is really just a formalization process of something that had already always existed. And then during Confederation, of course, the second largest number of fathers of Confederation were French. So like we've always kind of been bilingual, if not at the elite level. If not in the commons, then at the very least at the elite level, and then bleeding into the middling levels. That being said, the third component to this is that Pierre Trudeau attempted to use formal bilingualism as a weapon to blunt Quebec separatism. Didn't really succeed. But he tried to pacify it. He tried to pacify it by elevating their status to an even higher level on a federal basis. And by requiring English and French proficiency in the federal government, you limit the talent pool of applicable candidates to very small numbers. So you can, who has the time and the money and the exposure to be proficient in both languages? Theoretically, you could do it through public education. There's no shortage of French immersion classes where you do your entire education in English Canada in the French language. Upwardly mobile Canadians for a very long time did this. This was also the cheat code to good schools. The euphemism that you guys use as good schools, well, our good schools quote is French immersion, because it gives you better opportunities away from distractions, away from undesirables, away from people who would not succeed in public education, who make the learning experience very difficult from everybody else. So it's a combination of all of these things. Now, in fairness, I'm an Anglo-Quebecois. I'm a little bit biased. I am ethnically of British and French heritage. That is what my people are in the province of Quebec. So I have more of a harmonious, more positive view of this. There are certain elements in Canada who would say that they do not appreciate the imposition of the French language, at the very least, for day-to-day things, at the very least, practically speaking. Alberta, in particular, is very sensitive about this. Although they're a little, Alberta is odd because Alberta is very schizophrenic. They admire Quebec for standing up for its culture, for slashing immigration, for forcing the few who remain to assimilate. And on the other hand, it's, we want all our money back. You're a leech. You're not a non-contributor. Why is there French on my cereal box? I'm gonna go watch Little Mosque on the Prairie, right? And we used to make fun of them for that. They'd say, "Oh, you're this and that." And we'd like, "Okay, well, you'll complain about the French on your cereal box, but you'll go watch Little Mosque on the Prairie." So, anyway,
I appreciate a little healthy regionalism, like a little bit of
yeah. And,
healthy
and look,
regional.
to their credit too, and I will say this: is there a practical utility for you knowing French in Calgary? No.
Probably not.
Unless you're getting involved in the federal government, unless you're pursuing a career in the massive top-heavy state apparatus that is Canada and the bureaucracy underneath it, there's no practical utility to it. Do I think it's still useful nonetheless? Yes, I think there are benefits to having basic education in a second language, especially when it's the second biggest language in Canada. But should it be as stringent or required as it is? No. But really, I think something like 20 or 25% of Canadians are proficient in both English and French. That is ethnic Canadians. That is people who are of British and French heritage who have been here since the beginning. So that's my answer on the bilingualism question.
Gotcha. just to
Paul Celsius
Mhm.
tried to say that the language divide was something that could not sustain a state, except for the fact that we've done it.
Well,
We've done it since 1763 actually,
you
and
guys have threatened to opt out quite a few times, all things considered, to Mr. Celsius's point, and you guys almost did secede in what was it? Was it the referendum of, was it 96, 91,
95, 95.
95? I'm sorry.
No,
Um, I don't
but
know.
that even that I don't
I'm
know.
not totally convinced. Like you guys seem the federal system of Canada is a lot more flexible than I think we Americans give it credit for in terms of granting enough autonomy to.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And that is literally why the nation was able to remain together. Canada has a has a unitarian streak. We have a European political system. We have a unitarian streak. Not unitarian. Is that the correct term I'm looking for?
Um.
Yeah, Unitarian versus like Federalists. So we believe in state centralization. We
Mhm.
have no problem with the size of the government, provided it does its job. If the government needs to be big to do its job, we don't care. If the government needs to be used to curb the rights and freedoms of certain people to benefit the common good, we have no problem doing that. That's a very Canadian thing. Um, Liberalism, liberal rights and freedoms, these things, the rights of man and the citizen, these are just suggestions. Canadians are not a very liberal people. But the one thing we do and have succeeded on has been that level of decentralization. And to your credit, as you said, even in the time of Maurice Duplessis, this is why that was allowed to go on for such a long time. Um, like the French Canadians did have pretty significant autonomy within the province during this time. It was mostly French. Did they control every single institution in the province during the Quiet Revolution? No. Was upward, were they as upwardly mobile as they would have become after the fact? No, definitely not. That being said, it's not like, you know, the narrative of the Quiet Revolution among the Francophones has always been disingenuous and full of propaganda, as any
Mhm.
other cultural revolution is. As you know, as anything, the truth is always somewhere in the middle. It's always somewhere in between. It was neither total Anglo domination, cracking the whip of the Nègre Blanc, which is what they call themselves. Paul Valliere wrote the white ends of North America, or the white ends of America, where he compared himself and French Canadians to being white black people, white slaves. Now, this is insane and hyperbolic because the relationship between French Canadians and Anglo Canadians was amicable for 200 years. Literally, for 230 years, there were scarcely any issues. Decentralization curbed a lot of clashes. The elites themselves were bilingual, many of them ethnically British and French in ancestry. Um, but Pierre Valliere was also a communist. He was a Marxist-Leninist, and Michel Lalonde was educated by communists. So when she wrote "Speak White" and when he wrote "The White Ends of America," um, that is the anti-colonial sort of third worldist faction of the Quiet Revolution.
So how? So the Quiet Revolution was this massive cultural and economic change throughout the '60s. How did it? How did it end? Uh, like all of this the Quiet Revolution was conducted politically through the Liberal Party of Quebec, but how did it eventually end? And I think it has something to do with the FL. The was it the FLQ or
Yes,
yeah?
well, two things. There's two things really.
Hmm.
Um, the 1977 imposition of Bill 101. This was a massive game changer. This caused a massive exodus of anywhere from my calculation, somewhere between 200,000 to 300,000 English speakers from the province of Quebec out of Montreal. With it, all of the technical expertise, all of the professional expertise, industries, financial services, science, engineering, all of these things upping and leaving for Toronto. Um, so there was that. There was number one. It tore families apart, especially families who were of Anglo and French Canadian heritage, but for some of whom maybe spoke one language or the other or something to this effect, because it forced people to uproot their lives in order to stay employed and feed their families, right? So this is really, and it's also in the dates too, towards the very end. Like the Quiet Revolution is a 16 to 17-year period between 1960 to 1976 or 77. So, but the other thing, as you mentioned, yes, was the FLQ. The FLQ, the radical Marxist-Leninist communist wing, the FLQ, Front Libération du Québec, a communist terrorist organization that kidnapped James Cross, I think his name was, the
Yeah,
British trade
was
minister.
it Robert Cross? I forget what
Uh,
his name was.
James Cross, and yeah, he was a diplomat, British diplomat James Cross. So
Yeah, James Cross. Yep.
The FLQ kidnapped him, and there's somebody else. He was a Canadian politician.
Pierre Laporte.
Pierre Laporte. They killed
Yeah,
Pierre Laporte. That's right. They killed Pierre Laporte, and they kidnapped James Cross.
fled to
And
Cuba or something like that.
at the end, they fled to Cuba, not before Pierre
Hmm.
Trudeau pulled a gamer move and invoked the War Measures Act, which is martial law, and bringing in tanks in the military to lock down the city in order to deal with the threat. And this, even though they were merely a faction of the Quiet Revolution, they were not its representatives, although arguably their propaganda and rhetoric won out in the end, because you'll still hear boomers make the same BS talking points that the communists did back then, such
Is it
as,
sort of like back in the good old days when we
yes,
had
yeah.
national dress codes
Well, they'd be like, back in the
and we
old days,
everyone
they
lived
used to
on
tell us to
farms?
back in the old days they used to tell us to speak white,
Hmm.
and like that never happened. There is no written record anywhere accepted as an insult in Parliament that anyone ever told French Canadians to speak white. And I say this as an Anglo-Quebecois. I say this as someone with French ancestry. Um, so like, there's that, right? And anyway, to get back to that point, the FLQ kind of fizzled out. The remaining members fled to Cuba. They had arranged for safe passage to Cuba, and the radical segment of the Quebec sovereigntist movement died with it for obvious reasons. It was viewed actually in the same way that the Hungarians, that the public opinion towards communists in the economic realm collapsed after the USSR's brutal crackdown of the Hungarian Revolution.
I thought a
And
more apt example would be something like the IRA starting to have collateral damage
well,
with
the difference is that the FLQ were not very good. They were not very successful. Most of their
like
bombs failed.
I saw like examples of idealistic college students putting bombs in like trash cans, and they
Yeah,
only really
exactly.
went off like half the time.
That's right. It's nothing like the organizational force of Sinn Féin or the IRA or any of the various other Irish nationalist factions that were active before and after the Troubles or during the Troubles. But nonetheless, the public perception turned against them in this regard, and a wave of moderating, a force of moderation started to go through society. Maybe like 2 steps forward, half a step back, kind of thing. A lot of the rhetoric was kept, a lot of the ideas were kept, a lot of the core tenets were kept, but they scaled that back. And that faction ended up becoming people like Quebec Solidaire. They went into the academic, the university system to educate the next generation of student activists. And that's where you get Quebec's version of race communism,
Hmm.
DEI equivalents, all of these things, perpetuating these anti-colonial third worldist kind of myths, comparing their nationalist struggle with that, even though it's nothing remotely close to it. It's and they're to this day, yeah, to this day, they're really the only ones who have those kind of opinions. But nonetheless, their rhetoric still permeates across the Quebecois boomers
Hmm.
who peaked during that era, even though they don't necessarily agree with them on the transgender issue, on the mass immigration issue, or even with solidarity of Palestine or Algeria or any of these other places. But they will repeat things like, they used to tell us to speak white, and Anglos still control the province. They control everything. I'm like, none of this is true, right? Like,
So, in terms of, I guess, sore spots that exist to this day for Quebec, is there I recall some sort of Albertan Canadians tend to be very sore about how the national government spends a lot more on Quebec than it takes in terms of revenue. Uh, is this some sort of particular national, I guess, welfare system, or is this just like infrastructure projects disproportionately are spent in Quebec, something like that?
This is a very nuanced topic, and I have to be
Okay.
very careful with how I phrase this, because the truth is, once again, it's somewhere in the middle. So the purpose of equalization is to redistribute wealth where it is necessary, if it is deemed necessary by the federal government. And this is also a similar logic to transfer payments. Now, what many Western separatists, what many people from the Western provinces get wrong, is that they think that all of the money that the federal government gives to Quebec, that is taxed from all over the country, is actually equalization. It's not, and you can verify this yourself. Anyone listening to this can verify this by downloading the financial report of the province of Quebec between 2024 and 2025. Equalization payments are only 9% of Quebec's annual budget. It's actually very small. What is large are just generic transfer payments from the federal government, and that's because the federal government throws money where it sees fit, including the Western provinces. Um, People have this, again, another misconception that equalization is the federal government is taking money directly from Alberta and giving it to Quebec's pocket. That's not what's going on. It is the federal government is extracting all of this wealth and then redistributing it to the provinces for different purposes. But once again, that also includes Alberta. Alberta has received billions in oil and gas subsidies because the federal government has invested in them, but perhaps not as much as they have in Eastern Canada, and that's because Quebec and Ontario are the two economic juggernauts of Canada. They're the economic and cultural core of the country. They're the two most populous provinces. It kind of makes sense to invest that money there, right? That's something a lot of Westerners don't want to hear. But there's, in some respects, the East. Um, I would say that in the way that Washington D.C. and the tri-state area in northeastern America is important, whereas a place like, say, Ohio or Indiana may not be as economically and politically important. It's kind of like that. Although, mind you, Alberta is a little bit more influential than Ohio. But
Like, yeah,
yeah, so
I'm coming across all sorts of Albertan boomer Facebook memes on
so
equalization payments.
yeah, equalization. Trudeau, that darn Trudeau up in the east. Trudeau's gotta go,
Yeah,
brother.
yeah. I
It must be very jarring to you. I gotta say, like as an American, seeing these 51st state. Well, we're gonna leave Canada. We're gonna be on the 51st state. Wild Rose Country, yeehaw! It must seem very strange to you. It must be very strange. Part of that is because a moderate amount of American settlers actually migrated to Alberta about 100-ish years ago. Um, their cultural proclivities were brutally cracked down on by the RCMP, which is a good thing. The RCMP, then called the Northwest Mounted Police, were founded actually to stop the Americans from taking advantage of the free land that was being handed out for settlement, and then attempting to secede and join the U.S. So,
like
but
the my impression of Albertans is that they're how would I say it? They're
I
almost
have
like
to be very.
the epitome of the sort of like American Midwestern working class mentality
Mhm.
transplanted into Canada, which is like they're almost down to like their accents, which are very sort of Midwestern, in my
Mhm.
opinion.
I would say more like northwestern, north midwestern.
It,
So like their closest cultural parallel is like Montana
but
or like Idaho.
they somewhat sound like sort of like roughnecks and
Well, they
like
are.
contractors and sort of blue collar guys.
They're mostly blue collar guys. The oil and gas industry has made a lot of people rich over the years. It's extremely wealthy. You don't have to have any skills. You just need to have a strong body and a mind that's strong enough to deal with the grueling days on the oil patch. And if you can do that, you're walking home with $10,000 paychecks every 2 weeks, maybe more. if you go up the ladder. Um, and so much of that boom and bust economy defines their character. The struggles in the oil patch, the consequences more recently anyway, the consequences of the boom and bust economy where the jobs dry up and then they spent all of this money and now they have to pawn off their 4x4 or their skidoo or whatever they bought with all of the extra cash, the house, the wife leaves them and takes the kids. Um, a
Well,
lot of these things are very,
not
yeah.
gonna lie, sounds pretty nice. Not gonna lie, sounds like
Well, like,
a very like almost like a sort of boomer paradise.
yes, it is. Well, that's it, right? And of
Like
course,
with all of its with all of its ups and downs built in.
exactly. And that cannot be stressed enough. It's not purely negative. There are positives. There are positives to it, and there are positives to their culture. But it's not for everybody, and it's not necessarily very distinct. It is very very shared in that region. It's very shared on both sides of the border. Um,
So
yeah,
in terms of like I usually like to keep my shows to about an hour, but we started a little bit late, so I'm feeling a little bit generous. But in terms of sort of winding things down, Quebec. Uh, just about every sort of glamour shot I see of Quebec is of that one chateau in Quebec City on the
Frontenac,
hill.
Chateau Frontenac. I've been there.
Are there any other, I guess, glorious vistas across Quebec that are worth seeing?
The second largest Catholic church in North America is St. Joseph's Oratory in Montreal.
Hmm.
Oratoire Saint Joseph. I've also been there. I've drank on the steps there. It's a fun place. It's very beautiful. It was built in the early 1900s, but it is to this day the second largest Catholic church in all of North America. I think Mexico somewhere has number one. But there's also Old Montreal. Old Montreal is a preserved cobblestone street from the city's very early history. The city is over 400 years old,
Hmm.
and that's another tourist destination. But here's the thing: there are so many historical heritage sites across Montreal simply because the island, like even the borough that I was born and raised in, is like 400 years old. So like I grew up 45 minutes away from a fort, or at least the wall or what's left of the fort that an ancestor of mine fought in the French colonial army. And there's like little things like that here and there. There's the what do you call them, nunneries, places where nuns go, convents. There are 300-year-old convent buildings that you can just go and casually explore. It's very much like Europe that way. Is the
Hmm.
whole city of Montreal like that? No, and does it have as many historical attractions as Quebec City? No, but Montreal does have quite a few of them, and they're just everywhere. Kind of like how in Europe you can just you walk 2 blocks down.
Just
Oh,
go to
there's a
places.
Roman wall. There's a Roman wall. There's an 1,000-year-old church. There's a Callanish stones. I don't know.
Gotcha. Um, what else do I have? Oh, I guess one thing that I didn't really touch on is, I guess, the fall of the old sort of the old Catholic Church,
Mhm.
and to what extent has Quebec fully secularized in terms of what people do in their day to day lives? Like,
Okay.
is church attendance really like how badly did it plummet after the '60s?
So from what I understand, Quebec today has a decent level of self-identified Christians and a decent level of church attendance within Canada. The thing is, you never see them. You don't see them, you don't hear them, they're not a part of public life. They're not necessarily in hiding. They just very much stick to themselves. They have no role in the government, they have no role in society. Christianity, it might as well have never existed. And I'll use myself as an example because my own family has been irreligious for 3 generations since my great grandfather. My great grandfather hopped denominations to marry the women he liked. My grandfather was an agnostic atheist. My mother was a neo pagan, and I'm pagan. And that's kind of normal. The vast majority of people in Quebec are irreligious in a way that I would compare to the Europeans. Um, it's almost post-Soviet It's almost like I don't believe that in such a thing as clean slates. You can't completely erase something that came before. No amount of cultural revolutions or red guards can burn away and totally erase the proclivities of the people who came before it. But this might be the closest thing to that, in that Quebecers are hostile in many ways to Christianity. They have no interest in it. And the unfortunate reality is the mismanagement of the Catholic Church is largely responsible for that.
Well, it seemed like Quebec very closely matches, France across the
Yes,
pond, but
yes.
with a mixture of what my frame of reference was the antipathy towards the Church of England after World War II for
Mhm.
being such ruthlessly transparent shills for the state.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so it's I guess sort of
Although I will say this,
how would I describe
secularism is not an
French?
ideal. It's not a value in England. That's the difference. Secularism in Quebec is
It's
a
most
specific.
certainly a French value,
Yes, yes, it is. It's
which is how you get burqa bans or like headwear religious headwear bans in French government buildings, right?
mhm.
Very similar to what they have in continental Europe, and that's one of the pluses, if there are like very many pluses to having a ruthlessly secular culture. You can actually crack down on.
Well, it's been used for that purpose too. Many of the left's criticisms of secularism, and usually the reasons they complain about it, is that it disproportionately targets minorities because Christians can just wear crosses underneath their shirt. Um, but like to a point, that's true. It is a very useful tool, and that's exactly what it has been utilized for in more recent years. It's to stop foreigners from infiltrating in a legal way, to stop them from, or at least people who are culturally foreign enough that that religion might interfere with their duties and service to the public. And Quebec does a very good job at doing that. There are, for example, no Sikhs in Quebec's government. There are no Khalistanis. There are no Muslims. There are no radical Muslims. There are none of these foreign groups in the civil service of the province of Quebec unless they're culturally changed enough to abandon the traditions and conventions associated with those religions. So, for example, a deeply secularized, I don't know, Muslim person who drinks and maybe eats pork or something. Is it a perfect solution? No, as you said. But if there is an upside, it is acted as a filter, and so have the language laws. So have the cultural chauvinism. That is a deterrent. Is assimilation ideal? No. Is assimilation even possible for the vast majority of people? No. But nonetheless, even when you do want to assimilate people, you want certain pressures. You want cultural and socioeconomic pressures in order to
Mhm.
weed out all of those people who do not want to at least integrate as they go along to get on. And Quebec is very good at doing that. If you don't speak French, you're not getting a job. Period. If you're not even slightly bilingual, you're not getting a job. If you're not secular, you're not getting a job. If they just simply don't put up with it. They've put their foot down from day one, and this is kind of the norm. And over the years, it led to the stereotype that all of the English speakers were foreigners. And um, I think for me, the biggest tragedy of the Quiet Revolution, the biggest tragedy of Quebec, of what became of Quebec nationalism, although it's changing now, but what became of it over the last few decades was that effectively they purged Anglo-Canadians and Anglo-Quebecois from the province of Quebec, and then they replaced them with foreigners.
Oh, geez, that's
So they replaced them with foreigners, and there's a meme in French, which is at least we're not speaking English.
oh no,
Yeah,
that's that's one
and
hell of a boomerism.
that's because the boomers would literally say, "Well, at least the Vietnamese guy speaks French, or at least the Algerian speaks French, and well, at least they're not Anglo." And now obviously a Quebec boomer would sound it sounds the same. Just imagine Quebec French, but that's basically what it is. Um, so yeah, in my view, that is the bigger tragedy. It's that it turned brother against brother. It erased 2 centuries of cohabitation and peaceful coexistence, shared history, shared culture in many respects, and what happened was that they replaced them with foreigners. And many of these boomer nationalists do not discriminate between English speakers. So when they say Anglo-Quebecers,
Mhm.
what they mean is anyone who speaks English. They don't actually mean the historic population of the British diaspora of that province, or those people who are mixed between the British and French heritage, such as myself. They don't mean that. They mean anyone, nondescript, whether you're Jamaican, Italian, Jewish, Anglo-Canadian, Iranian, whatever. And so, unfortunately, now the larger component of English speakers in the province of Quebec are foreigners.
So all things considered, isn't Quebec still one of the whitest provinces in Canada?
Yes,
Just about,
it's 80%.
which it's no small feat.
No.
And all off the sort of cultural chauvinism and exclusivity of Quebec, which it's it's one hell of a feat, and it's definitely unique in North America. Like the only thing that we have nearly, well, all that we really have in America that's the equivalent of that is a few niche communities in Maine and
Mm.
New Orleans, which you know isn't particularly French. Even the architecture that they like to kind of boast about is
No.
more
I can t- I
Spanish
can
than
I can tell
French.
you all about the Cajuns and all of those Cajun LARPers that you see on TikTok and Instagram. They're it's just tourism. I can tell you right now, 1% of the population of Louisiana speaks French. They don't speak French. Those are they're playing it up. I'm telling you, like they unfortunately for the Cajuns,
Hmm.
um, they have been completely and utterly assimilated, totally destroyed. They're basically just white Americans
Well,
of some French heritage.
I really don't know many that would consider themselves French over American. They're very Americanized. About a year and a half ago, I toured the entirety of Louisiana for a few weeks, looking for or bidding on various construction projects, and I spent a week in Cajun country and didn't see very much French there.
No, no,
Um, but all things considered, I'll probably end up visiting Quebec at some point in the fall. So I'm actually kind of excited now.
yeah.
It's it's definitely a gem, and hopefully it won't get spit on too much by the Quebecois.
No,
Um,
you won't be. They're pretty charitable. There's a lot of stereotypes about the French and their attitudes, and a lot of that is very strange to me because, in the same way that American and British are very, very different people, the Quebecois are about as different as they are from the
mhm.
French. So, like, you're like the Quebecois are French Americans, French North Americans. They're not like Euros. They're not like there's a lot of misconceptions when Americans they come to Canada, specifically Quebec. They'll be like, "Oh, it's so European." Not really, it's just different, right? Quebec is kind of the halfway point between Europe and North America, and the relationship between Quebec and France is very much the relationship between America and the United Kingdom.
Mhm.
Um, the French Canadians, Lude, French Canadians drive Fords. Okay, like they drive Fords, they work
I,
construction, they, you
I
know,
don't even know what the French like car brands would be.
well, I
I, I,
it's
I beats me.
well, I mean, Canada has always driven North American, Japanese, and German cars. Like the last car Canada produced of its own was in the 70s. I can't remember what it was called, but so like French Canadians are an American people, and that's what the Europeans will say. That's what they'll say if you're from Quebec and you go to France, they'll be like, yeah, like you are an American people. Um, and this was well, who was it? Somebody said to me, he's like, you guys are basically American already. You should just be American, and I'm like, no, we are of the Americas. We are a North American people in general. We are an American people in the sense that we belong to the Western Hemisphere. And there are certain commonalities and shared experiences there, regardless of what country you're in. And actually, in some extent, that applies to Mexico. But yeah, what I would say is that I'm optimistic for the future when it comes to that province. It seems that Quebec is leading the charge for any semblance, any remnant of Canadian identity that has existed. And it's mainly because, in some form, they have very stubbornly resisted to just go into that good night. They have stubbornly resisted. And part of that had to do first with resisting the influence of Anglo-Canadian and Anglo-American culture. But the other part of it now is mass immigration and multiculturalism. And even though they're getting less and less of it, they're getting less of the brunt of it. They're still getting enough to cause some concerns. And in the near future, due to just raw demographics, unless Carney pulls a full 180, this foretold Carney pivot that I keep seeing and hearing about from all of the elite theorists, which has yet to manifest, and I'm not confident it will happen. Immigration and demographics mean that French Canadians have no choice but to cooperate with Anglo Canadians and vice versa. We are brothers. We have been brothers. We've always been brothers. Some of us are of both heritages, and the fact of the matter is, if there's a future for either of those people, and honestly, even Anglo Americans in New England, it's really that regional cooperation. There's simply no other choice.
Well, I think that's very well said. I think that's a very good way to wrap this up on a very positive note. In terms of appreciating Quebec for what it is and hopefully what it shall remain in the future. Do you have any particular projects um, or items that you would like to shill today?
For sure. So if you
Or
check out the Substack, you can see an article on, it's called "What is a Quebecois? The Norman Conquerors of Canada." And this will explain the majority Norman origins of the French colonists who settled in Quebec. Very few people know that Quebec or French Canadians in general are not, they're not direct imports from France. They actually came from a very specific part of France. And so they don't even have the full French gene pool. The vast majority of French Canadians are of Norman descent, and secondarily Breton and Poitevin, and that's really the northwestern corner. 50, no, what was it? Over half the top 30 most common last names in among French Canadians are actually of Norman origin, and that whole article is about the early origins of which of the explorers famous in North American history across French colonial America were actually of Norman descent, the Norman influence on the culture in Quebec, and so forth. But as for future projects, I'm currently working on the origins of Anglo-Canadians in Ontario, specifically on the Ontarian Loyalists and very early Ontario history. And I also have a piece in my drafts, and I verbatim mentioned the title today, which was "The Tragedy of Quebec Nationalism." And that is going to be my own take on the transition period between Confederation to Lionel Groulx through the Industrial Revolution, the Union Nationale, and then the Quiet Revolution leading up to it, and then sort of what the current state of that movement is. So stay tuned. Look forward to those. A lot of research, a lot of very deep digging is going into this. It's very time consuming to find esoteric sources and find them, 60-year-old books on Sci-Hub and Anna's archive. So stay tuned. It's going to be great, and look forward to it.
Well, thank you for being such a gracious and quite frankly informative guest. This is probably one of the more structured streams that I've had so far, and I'll see everyone tomorrow for the live stream featuring Capitalissimo. And good night.
Take it easy, everyone.